I apologize because we're 1 minute late. So we first have a presentation on Urban Tree Advisory Committee motion amending the amount of tree deposits.
Well, good morning. Brad Clark with Community Development. So we are going to walk you through a motion that you received from the Urban Tree Advisory Committee. And the relationship to your council goals is to maintain, operate, and expand our infrastructure to meet community needs. So for many years now, the Development Code has had this section in Article 11 that requires every developer, if you're doing either a partition or a subdivision, to pay a tree deposit prior to getting your final plat approved. And they basically act like a security to ensure that any trees that are actually required to be planted eventually get planted. And it is just what it says. It is a deposit. We don't charge any kind of fee on it. They submit it up front, and then when they come through the process, they get their houses built. We go out and inspect them, and assuming that the trees are there, they get their deposit back. The Tree Advisory Committee was looking at the amount that is currently in the code that is charged for the deposit, and that's kind of what instigated this motion to you. So the way that the Article 11 currently reads is it breaks it up into these three lots, or these three different levels. If you're in the R3 and the R4 zones, $300 per lot. If you're in the R16 and the R2 zones, it's $400 per lot, and if you're in the R18, R110, R112, it's $500 per lot. We don't have anyone on staff who was here when these were adopted. Our assumption is that, you know, those range because the larger the lot, the more trees are required. And so as you get into those lower density zones, the minimum lot size is larger, so you would have more per lot. So here's the motion. Chair Tripp moved and Vice Chair Renton seconded to raise the tree deposit of Article 11 to $400 per tree in all residential zoning districts. It was a unanimous vote. Two members were absent. So as I mentioned, the justification from the committee is that they believe the current deposit is too low. As I mentioned, the deposit right now is based on a per lot basis, not on a per tree basis. I don't think anyone would argue with that. It would end up being about $100 per tree to $150, depending on, you know, what zone you're in. And if in fact the city had to go out, purchase a tree, put in the irrigation, do the labor to install the tree, it's going to be much more than what the current deposit is. So they reviewed it, the tree committee reviewed it, and they, based on tree procurement and labor, their estimate to actually plant a tree is $400 per tree. And again, they believe that the intent of the tree deposit is to allow the city to plant a tree that a developer doesn't plant, and that would basically mean the city incurring additional costs if we did that. So I just wanted to give the council a little bit of background on how we administer the tree deposits. The developer submits the reimbursement, the deposit in full. If the trees are installed, we have our staff that refund the deposit, and that has to be within 30 days according to the code. We do typically try to get that out faster. It's about 15 days. If the trees are not installed within 1 year of the certificate of occupancy, we are authorized to install the required trees. They are reimbursable up to 2 years, so we hold the deposits in kind of a trust fund, and it's, you know, sitting there as they get, and it will be sitting there for at least 2 years before anything might be done with it. So The remaining fund balance after 2 years is placed in a fund for the purchase of trees for the city to use. So the cost implication, the Tree Advisory Committee motion raising the deposit to $400 per tree is, is obviously going to vary depending on the lot, depending on how many trees you're required to do in your partition or your subdivision. But if you were to break it down across the averages that we're seeing, 3 trees per lot, it would go from $300 or $500 today, depending on which zone you're into, $1,200. Since 2017, we've had 12 subdivisions that have not collected or requested their full deposit. And so those are ones that are at least 2 years old. So technically, according to the code, because it's more than 2 years, the city could go out and do that. Now, we've looked, and the majority of these, I unfortunately couldn't verify 2 of them, but majority of them look like they are actually planted. The developer just didn't come back and request the deposit. So that's leaving us a fund balance today of about $26,600 for subdivisions that are no longer eligible for a refund. We did actually send letters out a few months ago to those developers and just let them know, hey, just in case you forgot, you've got some deposits sitting here that you could use. But to date, we're not aware of the city actually accessing this tree deposit fund to go and put trees in. So is that your discretion? It's a motion from one of your committees. You can either direct us to start a code amendment to increase that tree deposit, request additional information, if you'd like to hear that from us or developers, or retain the tree deposit fee structure.
Rob?
Could you go back one slide, please? So, okay, fund balance of $26,000 that are no longer eligible for refund. So how many of those subdivisions are lacking trees that the developers have not fulfilled their obligation?
Well, that's why I mentioned we were trying to get that number. It looks like probably 2 or 3.
So if it's 2 or 3, that might be, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, right?
Right.
Theoretically. So I'm not sure why the tree committee addressed this, because it doesn't seem like we have a problem. It seems like we have, $22,000 in excess funds. I appreciate them looking out for us, but we don't have any kind of deficit right now. Like this is actually a profit center for us right now. Is that correct? Is that accurate? We're not in the hole in any way, are we?
Correct. No, we're not.
So
we do have surplus in that account. I was not at that meeting. The Public Works was actually staffing it at the time, and Jason, I don't know if he was here, could maybe give more background, but you are correct, Counselor.
Thank you.
DJ and then Valerie? Brian?
So it appears that the tree committee has determined that the current deposit is too low. What kind of analysis was done to come to that conclusion? Have they been talking with community development? Are there developments that have been waning in their promise to plant trees?
No, I think they were looking at it more purely from, just as urban foresters, as landscape professionals. The Urban Tree Advisory Committee has all those on the committee, and looking at it strictly from if the city did have to in fact go and plant trees because the developer failed to do so or a homeowner failed to do so, how much does it cost? And so they were using, today numbers in terms of average cost for a tree to go down to the nursery and purchase a tree, and the labor involved to do that. So I do know that. They didn't just pull them out of the air.
Sure, so that's the nature of the bond, right? And then so in order to get final plat, a developer has to put a deposit, promise to plant trees, and then there's a process of inspecting to make sure they did plant the trees before they can close everything out and collect their deposit again. Has there been any issues heretofore with the developer not planting trees and the city has to go out and satisfy the bond?
No, I looked back over the last 4 years and we have not had that experience.
Sure, thank you.
Valerie?
Well, I think that was basically what my question was, because I would assume that they were locating, because I do know they travel around and look at trees and that sort of thing, looking at places where they had not been planted, where they thought that at this point we needed to step in and plant them. But you're saying there's not really evidence of that at this point? So.
Correct.
Okay, so then my second thought is maybe they're thinking that it would be kind of a revenue source to add to that fund, but you said we haven't even touched the fund over the last, is that correct?
Right, the
So-
tree committee has started to look at opportunities to utilize the fund, for tree planting in other locations throughout the city.
Yeah, and I do know that. I do know that we're kind of trying to look for some revenue source. So I was wondering if were they aware that there was a balance in that account currently of $20-some thousand of money?
I do not know the answer
Okay.
to that. I wasn't at that meeting, so I don't believe that fund balance information was requested.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I had a question, but first I was going to see if either the chair or vice chair of the advisory committee were here, and if they are, if they wanted to provide any context or any statement.
Yeah, I talked to Doug Tripp. He was unavailable, and then left a message and an email for the vice chair, and I don't think that they are here.
Okay. So regarding that balance that we have, can those funds be used, since, they're just sitting there in that account, can they be used to plant trees anywhere in the city, or is that kind of at council's discretion, or what's the parameters of that fund?
Well, the language in Article 11 kind of infers that the city could use that money to go and plant the trees exactly where they were supposed to be planted, which would be in a subdivision, on lots where they were intended to be per the tree vegetation plan. I'm not aware of anything that would preclude us from doing that, but I think we'd have to probably look at the code in a deeper manner to see if we could use it for other locations.
Okay, thank you.
Rick?
Thank you, Brad. So Brad, if you had a subdivision where the trees were not planted, and by some reason then the property owner, the new property owner, came to the realization that the trees were supposed to be there, could they come to you and plant the tree and then personally be reimbursed, or does that money only go back to the developer?
No, it could go back to a property owner after a developer has final platted and completed the recording of the subdivision. It could go to either.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, there's been a couple of council people that haven't spoke, Vanessa or Kurt, before we call on the other people. No? Okay. Rob and then DJ?
So if a homeowner buys a property that doesn't have the requisite trees on it, is there any kind of lien on that property when they go to sell it, or are they free and clear and it's not their responsibility to do the trees?
So in
Understand my question.
a current platting process, if developer does the plat, they get it recorded, they start to sell off lots, 95% of the time, I mean, that trees are either going to be planted in the planting strip, in front of the house,
Right.
or in the front yard, occasionally in the backyard, depending on what the tree canopy plan is. So, those are usually done. This isn't intended, so if your question is if a homeowner buys a lot that's not in a recently platted subdivision, can they just come in and tap this fund? Then no.
No, I'm sorry. So my question, let me be more clear. So somebody buys a brand new house from a developer who hasn't put in the requisite number of trees. And then that buyer then wants to sell the house a year later. Is he on the hook for those trees? The new buyer, the new homeowner? Is there any kind of lien, so to speak?
We don't actually put a lien, no.
Okay,
No.
thank you.
DJ?
I'd like to understand a little bit more about this, what we're calling a fund balance of $26,000. Is there any kind of notice for the developers? Hey, you're done here, you've got $1,000 sitting around, pick up at the city?
We don't have a routine notice. What we did in the last 3, maybe 4 months, send out letters to the 12 that were outstanding to let them know, hey, you know, this money's sitting there. We noticed that you have never come back and got your deposit.
Oh, that's good. Some outreach effort I think is appropriate. So as far as this fund balance goes, it seems to me to be I'd like to understand that because I'm reminded of deferred development agreements and fee and lieu, kind of an issue. I'm not sure if it's reminiscent of this or not, but deferred development, it is for that property, right? Those monies have to be spent on that property for frontage improvements, right? But now fee and lieu is more of a general revenue source. It goes into the pot, and then now development can scatter throughout the city wherever Public Works, community development sees fit. Is this a kind of fund that is specific to properties, or is it a kind of fund that can generally be utilized?
Yeah, well, that's the question that we were just talking about with Commissioner or Council Member DeGrange, De La Grange. We don't know that. I mean, I think the Article 11 implies that it's really just for the property that it was deposited on. But since it's been more than 2 years, and the code says after 2 years the city can use it, but if they've already, if a subsequent property owner came in and put the trees in, then there actually is no need for that deposit to be put on that particular lot, you know? So then it becomes a question of can that money be used elsewhere?
So it's, to your knowledge, basically it just says after 2 years it's non-refundable and can be used, but there's really no structure. It's almost like we didn't really anticipate having this,
Right.
this overages of deposits.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Kurt?
I'm the liaison for the tree committee, and they certainly are under the impression that if they make a recommendation that we plant a tree, that the money's going to come out of this fund. So that's where their thinking is. So if that's not the facts, then they need to be corrected. And so they're really just looking at the basic fact that if we're trying to incentivize tree planting, that you make sure that the cost for planting a tree is covered. So to me, this is kind of a no-brainer.
Valerie?
I guess I just want some clarification on how, you know, because I don't know, even though I'm married to a builder, I should know this, but how the process works on an inspection when they're obviously written off and they've been inspected. You know, at that time, do they check to make sure that the trees have been planted? Or at what point in time do they actually go through and, because I do know it seems like they have to wait forever for, you know, be checked off for occupation and that sort of thing. So do they get checked off that they have met the criteria for the?
They do.
They do?
Yes,
So,
yes.
okay.
One of our planners at the time of certificate of occupancy
Yeah, that's
request is charged with going to the site and ensuring, you know, they bring out this landscape plan and
Yeah.
make sure that those trees are where they're supposed to be.
Okay, so that makes sense to me. So it seems at that point in time, the person who put down the tree deposit should know that, so that's why I don't understand why you put a lien on the property or whatever, because basically it's on the builder to make the plan, and then once he has been checked off by the city, it's pretty much a moot point. So then, you know, I'm assuming the money's sitting there for 1 or 2 years. I would think that the developer would know that they put the deposit down and come back for it, and after that, it just sits in the pot and goes back and to be planted for anything. So it just seems to me like maybe the whole process is not understood from the tree committee's, you know, as to how that money can be spent after that time. So maybe that's the clarification that needs to be established.
DJ?
Yeah, I just wanted to build on that. It's something I was going to say. So a builder proposes for a subdivision, and a part of that, they have to make a deposit for trees. You have to this regulatory statute that says you have to plant so many trees, you know, per code, and then you build out. And then, as Brad said, a planter will come by and check to see, one of their duties is, did you plant the trees? And if you didn't plant the trees, then they hold the certificate of occupancy for the lot that the tree wasn't planted on. I've actually ran into that before. We missed a tree, planter came out, said you don't have the tree, we planted the tree that evening, we called for reinspection, we got our certificate of occupancy. So, and I'm actually surprised to see that these deposits aren't taken. It's something I've been wrestling with in getting tree deposits back in a timely manner. So yes, there are checks and balances to make sure that every tree is planted, and I'm not surprised to learn that this is just a non-issue. The trees are being planted, and they're being inspected, and that they're being made sure of. And
Well, I know they want
you
that certificate of occupancy.
you know, and just by having this surplus of, you know, this surplus funds is testament to there's just not an issue. The city hasn't had to go out and plant trees because of a negligent developer decides not to. So I'm seeing this as just a non-issue, non-starter.
So we've had a lot of discussion, and the question then becomes, where do we go from here? And I heard several different things. I heard from the liaison to the tree committee. They talked about the cost of replacing trees, and they wanted to make sure that the city didn't get shortchanged. And then on top of that, there's Aaron, go ahead.
Go ahead and finish your thought. I just had something to add to the conversation as a follow-up to a
Okay.
question.
And then there's, that hasn't been the fact to date, because we have a surplus beyond the number of trees that we have to be funded. I heard a lot of people saying that it was, well, DJ said it was a non-issue. Rob said, well, you have a surplus fund. There doesn't seem to be a large need to act at this point in time. And the tree committee is correct in terms that the amount per tree doesn't cover the city's cost, but we have a $26,000 surplus right now. Aaron.
There was a question of council with regards to the fund that we have in place now, the surplus dollars, and what those dollars can be used for, or do we have direction? And the development code does provide direction on what you can do with those surplus dollars. It states that any monies remaining after the time, any monies remaining in the pot after the time of the 24 months that they have to ask for reimbursement shall be placed in a city fund for the purchase of trees to be planted within the development or elsewhere in the city at the city's discretion.
Brian?
That's excellent clarification. That amount of money could fund over half of the 100 tree planting goal we talked about earlier this year as strategic planning, so that's nice.
So do we want to have this go forward then and just have it be at a business meeting, and then we discuss it and vote on it? I don't see agreement per se. Vanessa, help me out.
I think Rick has something to say.
Rick?
I have a question.
Okay.
So Brad, under current procedures, somebody goes through and they get their certificate of occupancy. If the developer owes additional monies for something like that, then they would then write a check and pay for whatever else is due. But on the other side, do we have a procedure set up now, or could we set up a procedure that because the developer has satisfied the condition for the trees, that the city automatically issues the refund, or is it formally required that they have to fill out special forms to get their refund back?
So we don't have special forms, but we do look for the invoice to demonstrate that, you know, those trees were purchased and you know, for that project. So there's not really a form per se.
Okay, well, that makes sense. That we, the city, would need the invoice to confirm the plantings and the activity that occurred. So, and like you said, now you're in the process of sending letters to those developers to say they're eligible for that refund. Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Rob?
So it would seem to me that we have some ideas as to where those funds could be reallocated or redirected. However, if we were going to take that account balance down to essentially zero, then at that point, we may want to, have higher fees to actually cover potential costs for any developers that don't comply. But if we're going to keep a reserve account going, so to speak, let's just say $5,000 and never drain that account down below that, then I don't think that we have an issue, and I don't really think that we need to move this matter forward to a business meeting. But I think we need to keep in mind that if we're going to essentially reallocate those funds for planting other trees, we don't want to be in a position where our account balance is zero and we are not we're not collecting enough in deposits to protect against any defaults on that. So if we're going to spend it all, I think we would need to raise our rates, and if we're going to keep any kind of reserve in that account, then I don't think we have an issue.
Rick?
I agree with Rob's comments. Thank you.
DJ?
Sure, it also deserving of the conversation is development regulatory costs, particularly upfront regulatory costs. Now, a 10-lot subdivision is going to cost $3,000 to $5,000 in a deposit. It's more like $5,000 to $6,000. And if this increases, if I'm reading it right, it's going to be $12,000 to $15,000 per development. And yes, it's a deposit, and yes, it gets back, but that is, another $6,000 to $7,000 that a developer is going to have to dump upfront in a development to solve an issue that is just not an issue.
Valerie and Brian?
Yeah, I would agree with that. So I would go and say at this point that we don't want to drain it all the way down, but I think this information needs to be brought back to the tree advisory committee that, we had the discussion, but with the amount of balance that there is in there, and with the fear, as DJ said, that's, we put the CET tax on there. There's just a million upfront costs that, is one more thing to make housing more expensive. And I think we need to hold back on adding more to that. And since it doesn't seem to be an issue that, at this point, we just work with what's there and see and move forward until there becomes a bigger problem, because I don't see it as a problem either.
Okay, Brian?
Yeah, I don't see the need for us to take any action, other than potentially using some of those surplus funds for tree planting elsewhere in the community in the future.
Okay, it looks like, with the exception of the liaison, that people are satisfied because of that amount that's left on deposit. So at this point in time, we won't be moving it forward. But keep it in the back of our mind, if that amount that's on balance goes down, we may have to increase the costs.
Thanks for singling me out.
No, that's a good thing. That's a compliment, Kurt. Okay.
Of course, I'm going to support my committees.
Yes, you are, and you did a good job. Next is zoning transition overlay.
All right. So this is follow-up to a memo that the council received a couple of months ago, and also follow-up to the public hearing that you had on middle housing a couple of months ago. We're going to talk about the zoning transition overlay, and specifically the potential repeal of the zoning transition overlay in the development code, and it relates to your council goals to facilitate sustainable and manageable growth. So on June 15th is when you held your public hearing on the Middle Housing Code, HB 2001. As you may recall, there was a number of folks at that meeting, public testimony in opposition to one particular piece of HB 2000, or of the city's Middle Housing Code, and that is that in Article 12 at that public hearing, it reflected what the zoning transition overlay rules are. And one of those is it changed a lot of the zones where single-family housing is allowed today to where single-family housing would either not be allowed or would be allowed only with the planned unit development. So as a result of that hearing, the council remanded the application back to the Planning Commission for additional public hearings. We have talked about this a couple of times with the Planning Commission. At this point, they have not held another public hearing, and that's mainly because they were uncertain as to exactly which elements of the Middle Housing Code the council wanted them to look at. It seemed to staff that the primary issue here for the council's remanding kind of tied to the zoning transition overlay. And so that's really one of the reasons we're here today. So a few slides just kind of giving you an overview. Where did this come from? It was created at the time that the 2014 urban growth boundary expansion was happening. There was a package of multiple code amendments, comp plan amendments, and this was one of those, Ordinance 5630. And it designated about 450 acres of land that were scattered kind of throughout the existing city limits at that time, that would transition from whatever their base zoning is to a more intensive zone. And here are the areas around the city that were designated at that time, 2014. You can see they kind of fall both north and south of the river, and they vary from the GC1, GC2, R2, R31, and R42, depending on where you're at. The next couple of slides actually were not in the PDF that was mailed out on Friday. I got a question as to, well, can we see some examples? So I just, the next couple of slides are just some specific examples zeroing in on a couple of these areas of the overlay. So the top one here, maybe it's interesting that these are kind of side by side. So this is, let me see if I can get this other laser pointer here. So this is G Street coming down the middle here where it turns into Upper River Road. Capitol Hill subdivision is the one in the upper left with the star, and as you can see, that's pretty much all platted out, all built out. It was R18 at the time that the overlay was put into place, and this color, kind of this bluish color, is R2. So it went from R18 to R2. So the main difference there is that the R18 doesn't allow duplexes or townhomes or apartments, and the R2 does. So I think that's an example at the time, if the transportation system plan would have been adopted, all of that property could have developed out at something more than single family. It didn't. It built out as a single family subdivision, and that's what we have today, but it still has the R2 zone on it. Another example right to the right of that is a property that is largely undeveloped. I think it's about 6.5 acres. That has not platted out, and that as an R2 would now allow for higher density than what is the base zoning, which is R18. And then the third example on this particular slide, this is south of G Street. The GP Broadcasting Company actually owns this 10-acre parcel down here. Also has the R2 zoning. It also was R18. This is an example where they're actually seeking a higher density than what the zoning transition overlay put on it. They are actually seeking an R32 rather than the R2, which is what the zoning transition overlay put on it, and that's because they are looking at a potential apartment complex there. A couple other examples. This is off of, yeah.
Is your mic on, Rob?
Yeah, so you just said that that was formerly R1 before the transition overlay came in. Now it's R2, and you said that that would allow for multifamily or, well, not just allow, that would require then, right? Or no?
No, the R2 wouldn't be required to are you referring to the minimum density?
Yeah, so someone could still build single family there?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
So here's an example off of Northeast 9th Street. This is just south of Hillcrest Memorial Cemetery. There's 18 parcels that are in this particular area where the zoning transition overlay was placed in 2014. 15 of those 18 parcels have built out there, with some kind of development. So there are 3 vacant parcels out there today. This is just an example where, they could now, those vacant parcels, develop to the higher density that is allowed under the R2. Heading south of the river, here's an example. This is Willow Lane running north-south, Leonard running east-west. The Blackberry subdivision, you can see, is all platted out today. That was, again, coming through with single-family housing because that's what the prior zoning allowed. The R32 also is on, this is the Willow Estates Manufactured Home Park. This large parcel that doesn't show any plats, but that's completely built out with, I think, something around 55 to 60 manufactured homes that are on that. So this is an example where, the project either was already built or has built since the overlay was put into effect. And then here's an example also south of the river. This is Hubbard Lane, runs north-south, and then Highway 199 on the north part of the slide there. This is this triangular piece owned by RCC, and then just south of that, this piece has 7 affordable homes on it that has built out several years ago. It went from the R3 to a GC2. So the green is general commercial 2. And the GC2 doesn't allow for any more single family. So this one, even though it has 7 single family houses on it today, technically because of the overlay, they cannot continue to add new single family. So the overlay was driven really by a DLCD requirement at the time that says basically, in order for the city to meet your 20-year housing targets, it does not appear that you'll be able to do that with the expansion area in the urban growth boundary project. So, but if you add some new density in your existing city limits, then you can meet your 20-year target for housing supply. As we'll talk about in a minute, because of a couple of other changes, DLCD is basically deferring to the city in terms of how it wants to handle. The actual overlay wasn't mandated by the state at the time in 2014. It was a choice that the city made at that point to help meet its targets or to demonstrate how it could meet its housing targets. So how was it put into effect? Basically, as part of the growth management planning for that 20-year period, 2013 to 2033, there was amendments to the comp plan, amendments to the zoning map to help the city comply with the transportation planning rule and some other things. So it was created in 2 different phases. Phase 1 was basically when it was adopted in November 2014, through October 20. Now that October 20 date wasn't known at the time because it was linked to whenever the city's transportation system plan was adopted, which they didn't know when that would be. So in 2014 they said, yeah, we're going to create this and it's going to be in effect, but as soon as your transportation system plan is adopted, then these new zones are going to kick in. And so that happened in October of 20. That's when the council adopted the transportation system plan. So basically for that first phase, about 6 years, a property owner had that original zoning that I was mentioning earlier, either the R1H or the R2, whatever it was, and they could build out at that, or they had the option to build to the higher zone as long as you demonstrated through a traffic analysis that that your new project could work and could meet all of the transportation requirements. So that was phase one. Phase two, which is October 20 to the present, is when the new zoning came into effect. And that's, there's about 348 acres that moved from what we call the legacy zone to a new zone that mandated some kind of higher density use. So here's the matrix that was in that 2014 ordinance that just kind of shows you how the properties, what they were originally and what they moved to. All of these, the LR is kind of your low density, HRs are higher density, and then the MRs is the medium. So you can just kind of get a sense there for how properties went from either, one zone to another zone. There's a couple of noticing issues which actually were brought up, some of these as well at your June public hearing. I just wanted to make sure the council was aware of these. During the TSP adoption process, we did not actually send notices directly to individual property owners at that time, saying that this property would be automatically upzoned as a result of the transportation system plan being adopted. It was in the code, and property owners were notified in 2014 that this would be the case, but it ended up being 6 years until that actually took place. But in October 20, when that transportation system plan was adopted, that individual property owner notification didn't take place. The 2014, the phase two, as we talked about a minute ago, was estimated to be about 18 months to 2 years. That's the time frame that was in the code, and that was 6 years. The city's official zoning map was not updated to reflect the new zoning transition overlays until May of 2022. So it was about 19 months where the properties were actually on our official zoning map. While they did show the zoning transition overlay on top of them, they didn't actually show the overlay being removed to have the new zone. So this was a concern that you heard from the public, that if you were doing your due diligence and you went to the city zoning map, you would have had to kind of dig into that a ways to realize that your property had a different zoning because of the overlay. So just a little bit more about what the development potential is under the zoning transition overlay. You can see here the R32 and the R42 comprise almost 300 acres of the 400 plus acres. So the vast majority go to one of these two zones, which I think is consistent with what the goal of this whole overlay was, and that is to help facilitate and allow for higher density. And this is just a different way to look at that. This slide shows you by zone what the total acres are in the overlay in that particular zone. What we zeroed in on staff was the number of vacant acres, since a big percentage of this area was either already built out or was partially built out. So I think part of the question moving ahead is, what really is the potential to use this property in the zoning transition overlay for, triplexes, for higher density apartments. The vacant acres is 68.2. The vacant acres outside of hazards, meaning steep slope or floodplain areas or wetlands areas, is 30 acres. Now, that doesn't mean that the difference between those two, that you can't build on it. You have some development potential. It just, there's typically more cost involved if you're doing the steep slope or floodplain development. The biggest number on here is the underdeveloped acres, and that would be an example of, say, a larger 1 acre parcel that only has one house. So you have a substantial amount of that parcel that, could still be developed. We took a house on the property, and if it had 0.05 acres, we said it had an available land area of 0.95 acres. So that would be the underdeveloped acres, how that figure was derived. Oh, I should mention one other thing on that one. There are, as of a couple of months ago, we looked at the number of subdivisions or partitions that were taking place, actively in the zoning transition overlay that hadn't recorded their subdivisions yet, and that ended up to be about 15 acres. So drilling down a little bit more, so there were 68.2 acres of vacant land, of which 30 are outside those hazard areas. It's about 207 acres are underdeveloped, and 80% of the total underdeveloped acres, so about 184 acres of the 410, is within the R32 and R42 zones. We thought it was, important to point out that those are the two zones that are covered by the minimum density ordinance that you passed a few months ago. That those rules really kind of have a similar effect in some ways to what the zoning transition overlay was trying to accommodate, that it actually took away single family and actually required the higher density. So, and this is just showing you what that minimum density, what all of the areas in the city limits today that have either the R3 or the R4 that are required to comply with that minimum density rule of 60% of whatever the maximum density is. You have to build 60% of that. So,
Brad, could I ask a question on the previous slide, the one before the map?
You bet.
On that last bullet, the 80% of total underdeveloped acreage is within the R32, R42. Is that after the overlay, or is that pre-overlay, that zoning?
That is after. Yeah, that's only the overlay area. It doesn't include R3 or R4 that's outside the overlay.
Okay, thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, the -2 was the naming nomenclature that was used in 2014 to sort of designate if something was in the overlay or not. So that's why it has the -2, because it was actually it's a part of the overlay. It's just easier to recognize. So this parcel is looking kind of, again, having in mind what does it take to actually get a multifamily development built. Obviously there's no way for me to stand up here and tell you that this parcel will or not. That's the due diligence that, a property owner and an engineer, and they have to go through that and figure it out. But we have in the industry, it's fairly common to say, okay, well, if I'm gonna go for this, and if I'm gonna actually go for a multifamily, say 20 or more units, that 3 acres, you will often hear them say, well, I need that. And that's kind of a minimum. So we broke down into, say, 1 to 3 acres and then 3+ acres, just to kind of, that's why we chose that break. And this just shows you that there's the number of tax lots that are underdeveloped that are 3 acres or more is 11 out of all of the tax parcels that are in the zoning transition overlay. That does not mean that you couldn't see some multifamily development by any means, but on some of these smaller acreages, like there's 37 parcels that are 1 to 2 acres that are underdeveloped. But there is only actually one that is zoned R42 that is outside of any hazards that is more than 3 acres in size. So some of this is kind of moving us towards, helping to lay the framework for what is the potential here, and where does the council want to go with the overlay. So I think I talked about most of this. That table is just you kind of use to help what's feasibly could develop as multifamily. Duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, cottage clusters, and townhomes can now be constructed in any residential zone. So that's a big change that, I don't think anyone in 2014 probably anticipated coming down the pike. So that is one of the factors that I talked with the state DLCD about, and says, well, we do have HB 2001 now, which we didn't then. So there is a higher opportunity for developing some of these other middle housing products that we didn't have before, because it doesn't really matter whether we have the overlay or not. If you're in a residential zone, you can do any of those. So there's that one tax lot that I mentioned that's 3 acres or larger, that's outside of a special hazard area. There are 11 underdeveloped tax lots that are 3 acres or larger. 7 of those are actually owned by either churches, nonprofits, or schools, with the largest one being RCC. RCC has well over 50 acres, and they're part of that R42. The 4 remaining underdeveloped lots, as I mentioned, there was 7 of those that are owned by churches, nonprofit, schools. Then there's 4 remaining. Those total 21 acres. Those are privately owned, and they have there's 2 of them that have R18. One of them has R2 and one R31. So there's many more underdeveloped tax lots in the 1 to 3 range. There's 37 of those. But similar to the large lots, the majority of those mid-sized lots are zoned R32 or R42 and will be required to follow minimum density rules. So here's some of the main points that we got from the state. The city needs to rely on its own housing needs analysis and the buildable lands inventory to determine its long-range housing needs. They did not require the city to prohibit single-family development in 2014, and that we do have the latitude to allow single-family housing in the zoning transition overlay if we so chose. One of the key questions that I had for him was, if the council does decide to retain this, what's the status of those projects that are currently developing? I mentioned earlier is 15 acres that are actively being platted that aren't recorded yet. Their comment was that Oregon case law would likely support allowing any existing single-family subdivisions to continue to build out. So we looked at, based on that, what would be the potential impacts if we did a full repeal. And again, looking at, so a full repeal would essentially mean completely remove the zoning transition overlay altogether, which means you revert back to whatever that original zoning was. And the original zoning is reflected here on the left. So you have some GC property, again, R16, R1, all these lower density, and then R2, R3, R4. You can see that it's about 206.9 acres of underdeveloped available land in those areas, with the R18 being the most acreage that would not allow for the apartments. So the 48.72 acres, because the R18, now you can do up to a 4-plex, because of the middle housing statute now, you can go up to a 4-plex, but you couldn't go above that in the R18. Whereas, under the overlay, that R18 was all switched to some kind of R2 or R3 or R4, which does allow for multifamily. And this is kind of pointing that out, just that the R18 is 28 tax lots outside of vacant, that are outside of any hazard areas. Comes to 35 tax lots that are underdeveloped. 16 of those R18 are 1 to 2, and then 3 of them are the 3+ acres in size. So obviously this is all here for you to digest, and we can talk more about it, but I just wanted to call that one out because I think that probably has the most significant impact if you went with a full repeal. And then this just takes the number of tax lots in the new, or what I should say is the legacy zones, and what those would look like in terms of the 1 acre, the number of lots that have 2 acre and 3 acre. So a few observations from staff. The urban growth boundary needs to accommodate about 551 new multifamily units. That's according to our housing needs analysis that was adopted last year. And that's over the next 20 years. So even though it doesn't factor in current market supply gaps, that 551 number is just the projected new. It doesn't factor in any deficits that we might have now. It is what it would take to achieve that 551 at, say around that 15 to 20 units per acre. You'd need about 48 acres of land. And the net buildable land inventory in the city's high density is about 337 acres. So there is a pretty decent surplus there of high density zone land, even if some of that zoning transition overlay is removed. So again, this number looks a little different because this is citywide. Get back to Councilor DeLaGrange's point earlier that we do have R3, R4, and R5 properties that are not in the overlay, that are there that can be used to be built on. So this is what this analysis is trying to get at. The 2021 buildable lands inventory estimated that in our entire urban growth boundary, that the urban growth boundary contains 62 acres of non-constrained, meaning no wetlands, no steep slopes, vacant land in the R31, R32 zones, and 39 in the R4, R42, and then the R5, totaling 101 acres. So again, those numbers are the entire urban growth boundary, not just the overlay. So the overlay has 23.6 of those non-constrained acres, 101. So about 23% of the available land in the entire urban growth boundary that would be there for the R3, R4, R5, the highest density developments that we have, about 23% are in the overlay today. So if you were to repeal the overlay, then there's a chance that those 23.6 acres some of which would revert back to a single family and would not be available for apartments or something like that. The minimum density residential or residential density ordinance was adopted in May. We talked about this earlier. That requires the 60% now. That is expected to increase the numbers above what we thought when the ZTO was created. So at this point, there's a number of different ways that we can go with this, obviously, but I think what we're trying to demonstrate here is that we think that there's enough opportunity without the overlay to still achieve the higher density goal that the city has. So the zoning transition overlay was written in that context, and a lot of that language is actually conceived by Tom Schauer and others 1 to 2 years before that. So a lot of changes have happened. This is at your discretion. I think one important piece here on the third bullet down there, retain the ZTO with amended standards. Now you heard from the folks that were concerned about the zoning transition overlay taking away single family. I do need to point out that we have also heard at the front counter, this was not at a public hearing, but we have had a couple of folks that have come in and say, well, we've been waiting for the zoning transition overlay to take effect so that we can in fact do higher density development. So there are both sides here, and one of those I pointed out earlier is off of Lincoln Road. There's a 10-acre parcel there which, you know, has the original R18, and they've kind of been in anticipation of the zoning transition overlay allowing them to do higher density. There are definitely some benefits to us maybe doing more targeted rezoning as compared to a full repeal, which would take everything back. We could bring back to the council, you know, some of those areas that either we have talked with at staff level who have, you know, made us aware that they are wanting to do something other than single family. And then on the other hand, you know, we have a lot of acreage that is either already developed out with single family, and it really doesn't make any sense to have the overlay on there anymore. So a few options for the council to consider.
Questions? Rob?
So if someone were to, I guess you said that property owners in 2014 were notified that the overlay was coming at some point in the future. But if someone were to have bought a property between, say, 14 and 20, was there a way for them to know that the overlay was going to basically impact them when the transportation plan was implemented?
The only way for them
Could they have been blindsided? Could they have been blindsided if they bought a property in 16, not knowing that it was coming?
Right.
Could they have been?
The only way for them to have known would have been through their due diligence process to have looked into the development code and read it.
Thank you.
Rick?
Brad, if we were to consider doing a partial lifting of the ZTO, would we have a way of notifying the property owners that are in that package to let them know they may have the option of staying in or going out, either through, I don't know, different media or direct notification? So if that's the direction we wanted to go, those property owners would be aware of that option?
Absolutely. We can do any kind of mailing or, you know, write a letter to provide the options, however you want to see fit.
Okay,
Yep.
Thank you.
Mallory?
Yeah, I just want to back to what Rob had mentioned as well, is another group of people who would have needed to be in the loop were realtors. So realtors were also selling the land without telling the people that there was going to be an overlay change. Am I correct on that one?
Well, I mean, again, you know, if you read the zoning code, if you saw the overlay shown on the map, because ever since 2014, it's been very clear that there is some additional overlay on those properties. In that way, it's not been ambiguous at all. You know, there's always been shown some cross-hatching, and so, you know, that would be an indicator to someone to go and, you know, research, well, what does that cross-hatching mean? You could call the office, you could look it up, you would know that, oh, there is an additional requirement that could kick in on the property.
Okay, so I also kind of feel that if you bought property or you had property that, you know, that's kind of a taking in a sense, but I am open to those people who are interested in doing a higher density, having the ability to do that. So that only makes sense. So I don't know how you go about doing that, but to me, that's what makes this most sense, is for people who really do want to certainly allow them to, but not to hold those people who bought the property or had the property, hold them to the fire of having to make a change. So that's kind of my 2 cents.
DJ?
Yeah, I have 2 questions. So I want to ask about the notifications. I understand there was an initial notification in 2014. And then basically it was at the end of 2021, after it was adopted in 2020, that it became noticed again. And whereas it's fair to say that the information was there, I happen to know that the best of developers in this community were shocked at the zoning transition overlay. So basically I'm just asking for why was the notification so bare? What were the regulations as far as notification? Because there was, as you mentioned, a big surprise in the development community about this ZTO.
So staff's research tells us there actually, was no regulatory mandate for that, because we did do the notice and it was in the code that it would change. That is a different conversation than, what from a customer service standpoint maybe should have been done. But from a regulatory standpoint, to your question, we don't believe that was there, because the code had already identified and anticipated that this change was going to happen, and the code had never changed.
Rick?
So DJ,
I had 2 questions.
can I
Sorry, go ahead.
add to
Go
that?
ahead, DJ.
Again, being in planning all the years, when you do an area-wide zone change, you don't have to notify the individual property owners. So that's what happened here. Individual property owners were not notified. It would just be a notice in the paper. If you happen to read it or did research, you would see it. And that's why the development community didn't even know what was going on, other than it was out there. And the thing I would say embarrassed about is I was on the city council when this came through, and I don't even ever remember it going through, because it came through as a package. And that was a package to amend the urban growth boundary. So, but what I see now when we're looking at, and I think it would be further what you're saying, is if we're looking at making any modification, whether it's staying the same, changing it back, so forth, we need to notify each individual property owner that this is their option. Does that help?
Yeah, that helps. It's my opinion that, with all due respect, Brad, your answer was not satisfactory. And I believe that the individual homeowner, the development community as a whole, and anybody that deals in real estate literally had zero idea that this was happening until it actually happened. We're talking ready to submit planning applications, and no, you cannot do that because your zoning's just changed. That's my opinion. I think that some kind of effort to notify, I think should really be worked on, because if we can use this as case in point here, this was a big change that happened and very few people, and I'm going to join you too, Rick. It is a little embarrassing to admit that even I didn't know about it, which I should have, but it's hard to pay attention to everything. I want to ask about using that Lincoln development as an example. Given that DLCD has approved this zoning transition overlay and presumptively had done transportation studies, etc., it would seem to be that my opinion would be an application for rezoning would be, I guess, relatively simple compared to just starting from fresh. Is that a good presumption? If I was to apply for a rezoning, let's say that Lincoln area, I wanted it to be what that ZTO had determined it would be. Would that then be easier for me to do because all of this work has already been done to actually change it to a higher density?
I think there's a lot of validity to that, yeah.
Okay.
There's a lot of the homework's been done, so to speak, and, the intent is there. The comprehensive plan already reflects that anticipates that higher density, so.
Sure, because I'd have to agree with you, Val, when you just said, look, I mean, if we don't want the zoning transition overlay, but an individual property owner inside of that said, hey, wait, I was anticipating this, well, let's make it easy for them to do. If they want a higher density, I mean, I'd be the last person to get away, or to get in front of that. So that'd be worth investigating in combination with an outreach effort of some kind. Say, hey, if we are theoretically changing the zoning transition overlay and you were anticipating it, we'll work with you to make that happen. And then in the contrary, I don't think it's necessarily prudent for the council to force the hand into these higher densities of people that might not want it.
Brian?
Yeah, thank you. There's a lot here. There's a lot of charts and a lot of numbers, and I went through it 2 times before I got here today, and it's still fairly confusing with the amount of information. Has Housing Advisory had a chance to talk about this at all yet?
The zoning transition overlay in particular, the whole ordinance change, is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, just on this topic that we're discussing today, has HAC been made aware or had a discussion about it?
No, I think they have been made aware just through Amber's kind of reporting, in general, but there hasn't been an agenda topic. This is really more of an urban area planning commission because it has development code impacts. So we have talked about it a little bit there.
Okay. Certainly has housing impacts too. I'm trying to figure out, because there's like a lot of charts here that look similar, but obviously they're not the same because you wouldn't put them in here twice if they were. But early on in the presentation, there was a chart that had the development potential for the ZTO and the underdeveloped acres for R3 were like, and I'm gonna round these, it's like 160. Or an R3 is 55, R4 is 100, and then later it talks about if it's repealed and the R3 would go down by 65 acres and the R4 would be we'd be decreasing R4 by 108 acres. And I don't know if I'm reading that right. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it is accurate. Thank you for catching that. I mean, it's the difference, and I should have probably made this more clear during the presentation, but this at the first part of this presentation, we're talking about what the zoning transition overlay zones are here on the left. That's what the actual zoning is today, because those are in effect. The latter part of the presentation reverted back to what the base zoning is. And so, there's, as I showed on this slide here, where was it? Actually, it's much further. We have there's a pretty high percentage, over 60%, of the zoning transition overlay here is either R32 or R42. So if you assume that a lot of that acreage goes back to its original, then you're losing, you're reducing the number of acres pretty significantly that's in the R32 or R42.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. Would it be possible, I don't know, I obviously don't know what council wants to do here, but would one option be for property owners to, instead of like opting into the higher ZTO zoning, would another option be if property owners don't want to be involved, they could opt out so that, any property that doesn't opt out would just stay in the ZTO?
I think both are options. Yeah, both approaches. And what I'm hearing is, a mailer to all property owners and to identify what those options are.
Okay, and would another option potentially be to provide some sort of grace period or something to where projects that are in process, or we could even, for example, maybe say, the next 12 months, if you're going to submit something, you have the option of still using the original zoning, and then after that 12 months, then that option would go away. Could something like that potentially be an option too?
I think so. I mean, I'm looking at Augustus to see if there's any from a legal standpoint.
So for developments that are already happening, there's a vested right to continue that development to its natural conclusion. I think that in terms of allowing a property owner a grace period, there's a lot of things to consider. There might be an application that's put in for a development, and then something may happen over the next 12 months, increased costs, being a prime example where a development might not happen at that point in time, and a development permit itself isn't really going to be enough. That's something that I'll have to research a little bit more. There's a lot of implications into providing a grace period, and I don't think that that would be something that would be favored by most developers.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Valerie's next, but before you do that, Valerie, I was going to take off my glasses from a facilitator to ask a question, and then I'll put my glasses back on. Okay. So on the alternatives that you gave us, Brad, could you give us a relative ranking of how those different alternatives would meet the housing needs analysis goal that we have? Because it was somewhat unclear as to the, if they all meet the housing needs analysis, that would be one thing. If there's one that doesn't meet it and another one really meets it, if there's one that could possibly meet it, and then there's one that's surely going to meet it. So is there some kind of ranking that you have there in terms of how it ranks against the housing needs analysis?
Thank you, Counselor. Good question. No, there's not a ranking that's depicted here. Certainly we would not recommend anything that would keep us out of compliance with, the housing needs analysis. I mean, the housing needs analysis is just that. It's looking at what our existing supply is and what the projected is, but until you actually start to see, development applications come through the door, you really don't know. So it would be a challenge to actually say, okay, with this one, this is going to get us closer. I think all of them provide the foundation to allow for us to meet our housing goal of 4,055 units.
Would it help if I simplified the question, just look at two options? One is keeping the overlay in place, and the other one is removing it. What's the relative difference there in terms of meeting the housing needs analysis in the 10-year and 20-year period?
Yeah, well, if you kept it, the potential to reach the 4,055 units is certainly greater in terms of just raw, zoning and sort of the number of acres that are zoned for the higher density. But the market reality that we're hearing from the development community is that, they're questioning the ability to actually get them built and on the ground. If you just take the higher density zones, if you took the overlay out entirely and you're left with what is existing R3, R4, R5, then I think we can still get there, because 551 units of multifamily is what the housing needs analysis projects for the next 20 years, and you need around that 40 acres to accomplish that, and there's quite a surplus there.
Thank you. I'll put my glasses back on. Val.
Okay, well, I just want clarity on this. So this overlay does not include our urban growth boundary, am I correct? So when we're talking this overlay, we're talking about our current city boundaries and building. So it does not include the urban growth boundary. So the urban growth boundary, it will also be bringing in the opportunity for more units, especially as we rezone the urban growth boundary. Am I correct?
That is correct. I mean, I guess to be clear, is everything's in the urban growth boundary, but you're referring to the new rezoned area For the river,
Yes.
yes.
So as we're talking about the overlay was over existing land within the city. It was
Right.
not in the urban growth boundary, so it does not include any of the rezoning that will go on in the urban growth boundary.
That's correct.
Also, with the middle housing, that had previously, we had built our figures on the fact that all of the residential zones would be single-family homes and would not include any duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes. And now that has been opened to where there is a potential for that we also did not include ADUs or any of those in that. Am I correct?
That is correct.
So technically, I think what you're looking at is the fact that the overlay is basically, the housing needs analysis was built on the current. It did not include the urban growth boundary. So by extending the urban growth boundary and rezoning that land and the middle housing, that's what gives us the ability to make that goal, correct? Without the, as it is right now, with those new sources.
Yes, for the most part, although the housing needs analysis, the 3J and FCS did include the overlay.
Yes, but they did not include
In their overall projections, they did include the
UGB.
the overlay, the zoning transition overlay
Right.
in their projections.
Right. But,
To answer your question, no,
Yes.
I think I've got the question. is
Yes.
The two things that were changes to the environment in 2014 when the transitional zoning overlay occurred, between now and then, that would allow council to either in its entirety or partially remove the overlay, or two things that occurred, and that was at the state level with the change of residential zones, single-family residential zones allowing for duplexes, quadplexes, triplexes, that kind of thing. That was not foreseen in 2014, so a transitional zoning overlay was added to try to increase density in certain areas. So that was a major change that then increases density levels within the city itself. Then also, city council, above and beyond the state regulations, came in and put density standards in the R3 and R4 zones, which then increases the density levels within the city and the potential homes that would be built.
but the one question that didn't get answered was the urban growth boundary. Because when they did it in 2014, all of that was zoned county. So it was also not zoned. So as we go out into Allen Creek and rezone and go from county zoning to city zoning and choose to put in higher density as we move out, that will also give us more opportunities to reach that, correct?
Yes, there are in the urban growth boundary, currently right now, there are some city zone urban growth boundary, and then there's some also rural zone or urban growth boundary zoning, which, say for instance, Allen Creek, we'd be looking at, if that was rezoned, it'd be rezoned to city standards. But there are other zones within the UGB that already have city standards.
But Allen Creek is not one of them.
That's correct, other than the 5 acres right at the corner of Allen Creek and Harbeck. Otherwise, all the rest of it is county.
Just out of curiosity, where is the land that has been given city zoning? Is there a lot of it in the urban growth boundary?
There's a substantial number of acres that are not annexed, that are in the urban growth boundary that have city zoning.
Is that
There's,
out
I would
in the
say
west?
more than half.
Is that in the southwest area, basically?
It's scattered everywhere.
Okay, and that's where the developer has come on board with the people having service agreements for police and fire, correct?
Well, there's that, and then some of it was already serviced at the time.
Some of it is part of our intergovernmental agreement
Yeah.
for the urban growth boundary area, and why we have a planning commission like we do is it was agreed that some of the properties in the urban growth boundary would adhere to city standards, and therefore it has city zoning.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any more comments? Kurt?
I just want to try and summarize what I've heard to make sure that my post-COVID brain has been able to wrap around this, right? So the overlay came about because of our housing needs requirement as a means of trying to provide a solution. We still have the same problem, we still need a solution, but many of the zoning changes we've made since 2014 have somewhat made the ZTO less needed. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yes.
And so the way it was implemented was kind of rough on some people. I'll ask a question. I know you don't have the answer to this, but it's something we might want to consider before we make a determination. I'm wondering how many of those parcels were owned in 2014 prior to the implementation, and how many have changed hands since the implementation, just to kind of get an understanding of how many people have been affected, and which is kind of why I want to go back to what Brian had said too. I think maybe looking and giving everybody a chance to opt out, let them make their choice, since they really felt like they didn't have a choice to begin with, might be a fair way to go about it. Thanks.
DJ.
So there's a couple main issues going on here. We talked about one where there's an incidence where people were looking forward to the zoning transition overlay, and I believe that those are between the two of don't want the ZTO and was looking forward to it. The people that were looking forward to it are the minimal group, right? The majority lies in opposition to the zoning transition overlay. From that perspective, application to opting out, application for remaining, you know, we're going to process far fewer applications if we do it the latter way, which is, hey, can we maintain the ZTO? And that's something that, if you don't mind, we can look into and get information on the next business meeting. The other issue, generally, I'm speaking generally, is, you know, per council ordinance, residential isn't allowed on general commercial. We have instances of developed property with single family that can't do additions, they can't do ADA bathrooms, they can't do auxiliary dwelling units, they can't do another garage. From now into perpetuity, when the ZTO is here. We have issues where we have a real world example of a developer building duplexes for handicapped individuals and can no longer proceed because the zoning transition overlay has put general commercial zoning on their property, and now they're dead in the water. Now these are just examples, but these examples that I'm using are representative of the issues that we're having. And Kurt, what you mentioned is the reason why we have this zoning transition overlay. It wasn't made by the city to respond to a housing need. It was a requirement of DLCD in the state saying they have density requirements. And if we don't expand our urban growth boundary far enough to allow for those density goals, then they overlaid zoning in our current lands to meet their requirements. And they've clearly said to us, with the middle housing, that is no longer something that they are going to require of us, and given us absolute liberty in eliminating the zoning transition overlay. So they're walking away from this, which I've never seen that before. I've never heard of a case where DLCD says, oh, never mind, we were wrong, you guys can do what you want. So we have a very unique opportunity here to adjust our zoning per our needs. I think that the most reasonable and simplistic answer to this would be excluding the ZTO in its entirety, but then working towards expedited application for people that were anticipating the overlay for higher density, because they are out there. And with that, I move to bring this to
We haven't even had discussion
business
yet.
meeting in the future, and given information from the councilors what other information that they're going to need for the business meeting.
Okay, at this point in time, I don't see a second, so we'll go on a little bit with discussion, and then we can come back to that. Go ahead, Brian.
I actually thought we were still in questions. I had another question. I just wanted to make sure, like, again, this is like a ton of information. On one of the slides near the end that's talking about the staff observations and recommendations, it says the ZTO contains about 23% of the non-constrained vacant high-density lands in the UGB. So if we did some sort of repeal, would we be essentially, would that land essentially be reverting to non-high-density land, that 23%?
Some of it, yes.
Some of it, okay.
Okay, any other discussion? Okay, DJ, did you want to get back to what you were talking about?
Yeah, I'd like to continue this conversation, so I move to put it into a business meeting for more information and public comment.
Valerie?
I would just like to second that. I think that, I mean, let me make sure that I'm correct on what I'm asking, what the motion was, so I know what I am seconding. But the motion is to bring it to a business meeting, and at that business meeting, have them have the opportunity to repeal the zoning overlay with the option for those who would like to go with a higher density, within that, have the ability to do so.
So that would be
Yes, that's correct.
very similar to option 3 up there, except it would be repeal the ZTO, but have amended standards and guidelines and standards and zoning, and Brian mentioned a couple of them. So perhaps that would give some direction to staff for when we come back and have public comment and review the notes and see what some of those amended standards and zoning would be. Does that make sense to people?
Rob has a question.
Rob?
So I'm trying to understand something that I thought I understood, something DJ said. So DJ, when you were saying that you felt that it would be likely to be more property owners who would want to opt out of higher densities back into lower densities, there'd be more of those than there would be of people who are in lower densities who want the option of moving up? Is that what you said?
That's correct. And there's a couple bases to that claim as well.
So wouldn't we want to make this as simple as possible then, as far as the number of applications the city would see? Would we want to deal with the lower number?
Yeah, that's what I mentioned, the lower number being the people that were anticipating a higher zoning. We would experience fewer applications, right? If we were to do the opposite, whereas we're going to keep it and opt out, we would have many more applications to opt out.
I see, thank you.
So what I'm recommending is that we work towards a repeal, task staff with preparing some kind of, for lack of a better word, expedited process to opt towards higher density.
I think there's some confusion over the word application. I guess I would like it, what I foresee is a tally of those that want to stay in and a tally of those that want to stay out. And we as the city council could then act on that motion. But as far as an application goes, I think part of the confusion can be there is I'm not in favor of those that want to retain the ZTO zone of having to file their own personal zone change application by themselves. In other words, the zone is there right now, And if those people want to retain it, why are we going to take it away and then make them come back? I just clarifying, there can be confusion over the word application. We're not going to make them make a new application to come for the zone change because we've eradicated the whole zone. We're going to look at a partial vacation. So those people that want it will still retain it. Is that?
Yeah, sure, that makes sense. And I would agree, but it really boils down to what staff can come up with as far as retaining a higher density zoning, right? I mean, is it possible to say, since we're putting out information in a mailer, if you want to maintain higher density, please check the yes box and send it back to us, and Bob's your uncle. You know, I don't know if it could be that simple, but if it was that simple, there you go. But there's a question that needs to be answered there on what that process would look like.
Okay, we have a motion and a second on the floor, and then Brian has some comments concerning that. Brian?
Yeah, I'm just concerned about this particular path because the opting into the higher zoning takes away a lot of our potential for, you know, a lot of these properties are probably owned by people who may at this point not necessarily have strong feelings one way or the other. You know, there's the people that want the upzoning and the people that don't want the upzoning, and then there's probably this big group in the middle that at this point are fairly indifferent. So we would be ceding the upzoning on a lot of that if we had, if we went with the motion on the table, as opposed to an opt-out motion where the people that didn't want to be involved could opt out, and we could keep the potential for the higher zoning that would help our housing goals more.
So we're starting to repeat ourselves, which is a good sign that we're probably ready to vote on the motion. And as we move forward, the answer is yet to be determined, and it will be a business meeting with public input, which is a good thing.
And that being the primary goal of my motion is we've talked about it. We've had the information for a long time. This is not a new issue, and it's time to get public comment and move on with the discussion.
So, DJ, could you repeat your motion for me?
Yeah, my motion is simple, is to move this to a business meeting with all information provided, information asked of staff to prepare as far as procedure for opting out, and to just take it to a business meeting. It's just that simple.
Okay, how do you vote?
Yes.
Valerie?
Yes.
Vanessa?
I'll vote no because I don't think that we, as a council, have discussed this enough. This is the first time that this is coming before us. And we are talking about some really precious high-density land, so I'd like to see us have another discussion on this before a business meeting. No.
Okay. Brian?
No.
Kurt?
Yes.
Rob?
Yes.
Rick?
I think it's appropriate to move it to a business meeting, which also allows the public to be part of that input, so I'm voting yes.
Okay, I guess I have a vote here too. I better put on my glasses. That's right. Yeah, I can't see anything. Okay, hang on. I think it's important that we have public input on this and that we don't make a decision today. What we're making is a hypothesis, and there's still some legitimate disagreement up here, and we'll have more discussion. So I'll vote yes to move it to a business meeting for that discussion and public input and to confront our differences. Brian?
So when we have that business meeting and we get public input, I don't know how feasible it is, but it would be really valuable if the people that own land in the ZTO were aware of the public comment period, so everyone has an opportunity to speak.
I think we're all in agreement with that. So as much as we can do to encourage that, I would encourage staff and everyone up here to do that. Okay, good job, folks. Okay, we got a agenda review. Let's review the general agenda, and then there's a specific subtopic on the Central Business District Revitalization Task Force motion. So first off, I'm not going to read the agenda to you. It's published for those that are watching on our website, but does anybody have any questions, additions, or subtractions for our September 7th meeting? No. How about our September 12th or 19th workshop. Any of the meetings thereafter, is there any suggestions? Oh, DJ.
So that September 12th meeting, maybe you guys have talked about it, been on vacation and whatnot. So the nature of that September 12th workshop, discussion on barriers and incentives on financing, construction, lending, residential development. I know there's been conversations about how that meeting should go and how to facilitate more of a, like an actual workshop with input from players, lenders, home builders association, et cetera. How can we expect that meeting to go? One more comment in that the general workshop procedure is no public comment, but we're inviting developers. HBA is poised to prepare something. We're inviting lenders, they're poised to prepare something. That doesn't jive very well with the general workshop format. And I know it's been talked about a bunch, but I'm not privy to how we've landed.
You want to go first, Vanessa? Go ahead.
I think we might benefit from having a roundtable type setting like we did for the urban campground discussion, where people are invited to speak on the dais actually as an expert in their field.
Sure, yeah, I'm also in favor of that, to having a, you know, it's not typical for our workshop, but really having more roundtable, if we call it that. I think we all understand what that definition means, opposed to a workshop. So I'm just asking how we're gonna go about doing that.
Aaron, do you have anything to add to it?
So I'm taking my lead from the council president and the mayor, and I've asked many questions with regards to what this looks like. Because we have 8 council members and a mayor, and maybe all have different perspectives on how this thing should run. We do have consensus on who's going to be at the table for that discussion as an expert on this issue. I think we have 8 or 9 individuals that will be present. The direction that I currently have right now is that it will be sort of a forum type of process where the individuals, the experts in the field, will be on the dais, sitting where you're sitting. There'll be up to 9 individuals, and they'll be on the upper part of the dais. Council will then fill the area here. We'll have the tables for you. You'll be sitting at the tables, and then there'll be also some room for other individuals that want to be present, advisory committee members or other entities within the community that have a stake in this. The individuals on the dais will be asked to respond to a couple of questions with regards to what are barriers to multifamily housing in your field. And we go through and they will answer those questions. And then at that time, because of a timing issue, et cetera, my thought would be, and the discussion is, it's an opportunity for them to give you information. So then the questions will be answered. Council will have an opportunity for dialogue or follow-up questions, but it's not necessarily an open field for everyone present to start to ask questions, because you may have 40 extra people and there will not be an end to the meeting unless there is some really strong facilitation that occurs. And I've not been directed to facilitate it, so I'm not sure how that facilitation is going to take place. It'll be the mayor or the council president, I'm guessing, that will sort of keep things running. And so that's the picture that I've painted. Sure. People on the dais that are experts, they're going to answer a couple of questions according that are based on barriers to multifamily development, and then council will be able to ask questions of those experts.
That's great. I'm glad to hear it. Now, the 9 individuals that are up here, I know that the Home Builders Association desires to have representation here. Is there somebody coming from their organization? I'm just curious, who are the 9? I don't want you to say who are the 9 individuals. I just want to make sure that there's a representation from the association.
We have asked Gail Atkins to
Okay.
represent them.
Okay, very good. Thank you. That's all the questions I had about that meeting.
Okay, any other comments? We do have a sub-item under agenda review, the Central Business Task Force motion. We do have that scheduled on the agenda for October 3rd, and I would assume then that we would address that motion if appropriate at that time. Does that make sense to everybody?
Could you repeat that, Joel, please?
Okay, so under our agenda today, we had the Central Business District Vitalization Task Force motion. Well, we're not going to get the report until October 3rd, and so that we would consider that motion at that time if appropriate. Okay. Okey dokey. Put my glasses back on. We need a motion to adjourn the workshop and convene a meeting and executive session.
So moved?
Second? Valerie, how do you vote?
Yes.
DJ?
Yes.
Joel? Yes. Rick?
Yes?
Rob?
Yes.
Yes.
Kurt?
I said yes.
Okay, I'm sorry. I can't hear. Brian?
Yes.
Vanessa?
Yes.
Okay. With that, we'll move into executive session.